Ethan Hartman, a successful lawyer, unexpectedly crosses paths with a young boy named Charlie. What he doesn't know is that this boy is the missing son of his estranged friend, Tom Miller. As Ethan steps in to help, he becomes entangled in a fight to reunite father and son, while old wounds resurface and painful truths emerge. Will Ethan bring this family back together, or will their past tear them apart for good? If you're ready for an emotional journey of love, loss, and redemption, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Ethan Hartman's mornings were as sharp and precise as the suits he wore. The sun barely crept over the horizon when he left his upscale apartment on the Upper West Side, a crisp October breeze nipping at the edges of his tailored coat. He hardly noticed. His mind was already occupied, ticking through the day's to-do lists like a perfectly calibrated machine. He had cases to win, partnerships to solidify, and a career that needed constant feeding to maintain its momentum. For most, a career like Ethan's, on the verge of being named senior partner at New York's most prestigious law firm, would be a dream. To Ethan, it was the only dream. It had consumed him, shaped him, and pushed everything else to the periphery. Relationships had been sacrificed, friendships neglected. Ethan's only constant companions were the ticking of deadlines and the hum of elevator doors closing on another late night. As he walked down the crowded sidewalk, his Italian leather briefcase clutched tightly, he barely registered the people around him. To Ethan, they were obstacles. They clogged the streets at their slow pace, absorbed in their smartphones or idle chatter. His path was clear, and anyone in his way was simply delaying his success. But this morning, fate placed a different kind of obstacle in his way. Turning the corner onto 34th Street, Ethan nearly stumbled. His foot had caught on something small, a boy. The kid couldn't have been more than 10, his clothes ragged and eyes wide. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, holding a cardboard box filled with candy bars, his gaze pleading. "Hey, mister," the boy said, his voice trembling as much as his small frame. "You want to buy some candy? It's to help my school." Ethan barely glanced at him, irritation already flaring in his chest. The boy's oversized sweatshirt hung loosely on his small body, and his hair was unkempt. His eyes, though, vividly green, had a strange, haunted look that momentarily pulled at Ethan's attention. "Out of the way, kid," Ethan snapped, pushing past him. The boy stumbled, and his box tipped, scattering the candy bars across the pavement. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't even look back. All he could think about was how little time he had, how he couldn't afford any distractions this morning, not with the partners' meeting looming. His footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete, and the image of the boy was quickly dismissed from his mind as the doors to his firm's glass tower opened to welcome him into its familiar, sterile embrace. "Good morning, Mr. Hartman." Ethan barely acknowledged his assistant, Rebecca, as she handed him his coffee and a stack of documents for the day. The words "partner review" were boldly printed across the top sheet. He scanned the first few lines, already thinking of how he'd defend his case to the board. His promotion was within reach, and nothing would stand in his way. Nothing ever did. "Your 9 o'clock with the Wexler clients is confirmed," Rebecca said, glancing nervously at Ethan. "And, you also got a call from a Tom Miller?" Ethan paused, his brow furrowing. Tom Miller. The name tugged at something deep in his memory, a connection to a life he hadn't thought about in years. Tom had been his best friend in college. They had been inseparable, practically brothers. Late-night study sessions, shared dreams of conquering the legal world together, until life had pulled them apart. Ethan had stayed in New York, climbing the corporate ladder, while Tom had drifted into a quieter existence after law school, disappearing from Ethan's life without much notice. Ethan hadn't heard from him in years, but now, out of nowhere, there was a voicemail. Rebecca hovered uncertainly as Ethan stared at his phone, his thumb brushing over the notification. He could already guess what it was, an old friend reaching out in need of something. Everyone needed something from him. "I'll listen to it later," he muttered, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He had more important things to focus on right now. The rest of the day was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and negotiations. But every so often, Tom's name would pop back into Ethan's thoughts like a ghost whispering at the back of his mind. What could Tom want after all these years? And why now? It wasn't until much later, when the office had emptied out and the only light in his corner of the building was the dim glow of his desk lamp, that Ethan finally opened the voicemail. "Hey, Ethan, it's, Tom. Tom Miller. I don't know if you'll even get this or if you remember me, but I really need your help. It's about my son. He's been missing for 3 years." Ethan's blood ran cold as Tom's voice cracked with emotion. The message was raw, filled with a kind of desperation Ethan wasn't used to hearing. "I know it's been a long time," Tom continued, "and I know we haven't talked in years, but I don't know who else to turn to. I've tried everything. Please, Ethan, call me back." There was a long pause, and then the message ended. Ethan sat back in his chair, the weight of the message pressing down on him. Tom's son, missing, for 3 years? He didn't know what to feel. Sympathy? Guilt? Could he even help after all this time? Ethan glanced at the clock. It was already past 10. With a heavy sigh, he reached for the phone. The phone rang once, then twice before Tom's voice came through the line. "Ethan?" Tom's voice was rough, like he hadn't slept in days. "Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," Ethan said, feeling awkward and unsure. "I got your message." There was a long pause. Ethan could hear the tension on the other end of the line, a tension he hadn't expected. "Ethan, I didn't know if you'd call back," Tom finally said, his voice thick with relief. "I didn't know if you even—" "I got your message," Ethan interrupted, not wanting to prolong the emotional pleasantries. "What's going on, Tom? What happened?" "It's Charlie, my son. He went missing 3 years ago. I've been searching for him ever since." Tom's voice cracked, and Ethan could hear the years of heartache layered beneath the words. Ethan's mind raced. A missing child for 3 years? It was every parent's nightmare. But the way Tom spoke, the rawness in his voice, made it clear that he hadn't given up, not even for a second. "I've tried everything, Ethan," Tom continued. "The police, private investigators, they all gave up. But I can't. He's my boy. I just can't." Ethan felt something stir deep in his chest, something that resembled empathy, though it was a foreign sensation to him these days. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his detached professionalism. "What do you need from me, Tom? How can I help?" "I don't know," Tom admitted. I need someone I can trust. I don't even know where to start anymore. I thought, with your connections, maybe you could point me in the right direction." Ethan hesitated. This wasn't his area of expertise. He was a corporate lawyer, not a detective. But hearing the desperation in Tom's voice, hearing the sheer weight of what he was carrying, Ethan felt a tug of responsibility he hadn't expected. "I'll see what I can do," Ethan said finally. "But Tom, I need details. What happened? How did Charlie go missing?" Tom hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was hollow. "It was my fault," he whispered. "I wasn't there when he needed me. I wasn't there for my wife either." Ethan frowned, sensing that there was more to the story, but Tom didn't elaborate. Instead, he quickly added, "Look, I'll send you everything I have. I can't lose hope, Ethan. I can't." Ethan ended the call, his mind spinning. He glanced out the window at the darkened city below. The weight of the conversation was still heavy on his chest. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a crack in the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could help. The next morning, Ethan's routine was disrupted. Normally, he'd head straight into the office, his mind focused on the day's tasks. But today, he found himself walking a different path. He returned to the same corner where he had seen the boy the day before. Sure enough, the kid was there again, sitting on the cold pavement, his box of candy resting beside him. His green eyes were just as haunted as before, and Ethan felt an uncomfortable twist in his gut. He approached cautiously, unsure of what he would say. "Hey," Ethan started, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The boy looked up at him warily, recognizing him from the day before. I'm sorry about yesterday." The boy blinked, clearly taken aback by the apology. Ethan hesitated. Apologizing wasn't something he was used to. "Look, what's your name?" he asked, kneeling down to get on the boy's level. The boy hesitated for a long moment before finally mumbling, "Charlie." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Charlie, Tom's son. It couldn't be. Could it? Charlie, Ethan repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. How old are you? 10, the boy answered, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to be sure. And your dad, where is he? Charlie tensed, his small hands gripping the edge of his box. He's gone, he muttered, his voice thick with pain. He didn't want me anymore. Ethan felt a surge of guilt so intense, it nearly knocked the breath out of him. This was Tom's son, the boy he had been searching for, the boy who had been lost for 3 years, was right here in front of him. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind reeling. Charlie, he said softly, I know your dad. He's been looking for you. He never stopped. Charlie's eyes widened, a flicker of hope and disbelief flashing across his face. You know my dad? Ethan nodded, his heart racing. Yeah, and I promise, we're going to make this right. Ethan could feel the weight of Charlie's eyes on him as they walked in silence. His mind raced. What was he supposed to say to a child who thought his father had abandoned him? He wasn't used to this kind of situation. This wasn't a courtroom where words were his weapon. This was a broken boy, and the stakes were far more personal. Charlie clutched his candy box tightly as they crossed into a quieter street. Ethan's sleek apartment building loomed ahead, and he saw the boy glance nervously at it. Charlie had likely never seen a place like this. Everything about it screamed luxury. Ethan could feel the boy's discomfort radiating off him. When they entered the apartment, Ethan's anxiety spiked. His place was minimalist, pristine, not a single thing out of place. The polished marble floors gleamed under the warm light, and large windows framed the twinkling skyline. Charlie froze in the doorway, his eyes wide as if he'd stepped into a completely foreign world. You live here? Charlie asked, barely above a whisper. His small voice carried a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Ethan cleared his throat, feeling oddly out of place in his own home. Yeah, just me, he said, forcing a smile. Come on in. You can make yourself at home. Charlie hesitated, looking around like he didn't quite believe he belonged. Ethan's heart squeezed, and he cursed himself silently. The boy had been living on the streets for who knew how long, and now he was thrust into a world so different from his reality. Ethan hadn't prepared for this, hadn't even considered what bringing Charlie here might mean. Are you hungry? Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone light. Charlie shrugged, his eyes still scanning the room like he was expecting it to disappear. I guess. Ethan nodded awkwardly, walking into the kitchen. He wasn't much of a cook. His fridge was stocked with takeout containers more than groceries, but he managed to find some cereal and milk. How about cereal? He called out. Okay, Charlie said quietly. As Ethan set the bowl in front of him, Charlie stared at it like it was foreign. Ethan realized the boy hadn't even removed his coat yet. You can take your jacket off, he suggested gently. You'll be more comfortable. Charlie blinked at him, and for a second, Ethan saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or doubt. Slowly, Charlie shrugged off the too large jacket, revealing a threadbare sweater underneath. Ethan sat down across from him, the quiet between them growing heavier. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but every thought felt inadequate. This wasn't a legal negotiation he could win with logic. This was a child who had been abandoned, lost, and broken. After a few awkward minutes of watching Charlie eat, Ethan finally spoke. Charlie, he began carefully, I need to ask you something. And it's important. Charlie looked up, his green eyes wary. Your dad, Tom, he's been looking for you for a long time. He told me what happened. But I want to hear from you. What do you remember about why you left? The spoon clattered in Charlie's bowl as his hand trembled. His gaze dropped to the table, his small shoulders hunching in on themselves. Ethan waited, heart pounding, as the boy's lip quivered. My mom said... Charlie's voice was barely audible, and Ethan had to lean in to hear. She said he didn't want us anymore, that he was going to leave us, so we had to leave first. Ethan's throat tightened. Tom had told him about Charlie's mother, how she had suffered from severe depression. She must have said terrible things, filled the boy's head with lies to justify why they ran. Ethan could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, the unfairness of it all. "Charlie," Ethan said, his voice steady, "your dad never stopped looking for you. He didn't leave you. He's been trying to find you for 3 years." Charlie's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. "But Mom said—" "I know," Ethan interrupted gently. "I know what she said. But it wasn't true. Your dad never gave up on you." Tears welled up in Charlie's eyes, and he bit his lip to keep them from falling. Ethan didn't push him, didn't move, afraid that one wrong word would send the boy retreating back into himself. He watched as Charlie processed the information, the slow unraveling of everything he had believed for the past 3 years. Finally, Charlie whispered, "Can I see him?" Ethan nodded, relieved washing over him. "Yeah, I'll call him." Tom Miller arrived at Ethan's apartment within the hour, his face pale and strained as he stood at the door. Ethan could see exhaustion in his eyes, the years of searching and hoping etched into every line of his face. When Charlie saw him, he didn't move. His eyes were wide, frozen, and Ethan could feel the tension ripple through the room. Tom's breath hitched as he saw his son for the first time in 3 years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things unsaid. "Charlie," Tom whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. "Oh God, Charlie." But Charlie didn't move. His eyes darted from Tom to Ethan and back again, confusion and fear clouding his face. He took a small step back, his body tensing as if preparing to bolt. "Charlie," Tom tried again, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to leave you." Ethan's heart ached as he watched the scene unfold. This was what Tom had been fighting for, what he had been dreaming of, reuniting with his son. But it wasn't the joyful moment he had imagined. It was raw, painful, and filled with all the years of misunderstanding and hurt. "You left us," Charlie said, his voice small but sharp. "Mom said you didn't want us anymore." Tom's face crumpled, and he dropped to his knees, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "That's not true," he pleaded. "I never left you, Charlie. I never would." Charlie shook his head, stepping back again, the tears now spilling down his cheeks. "But you weren't there. You weren't there when we needed you." Tom's hands trembled as he reached out, but he didn't touch Charlie, afraid it would push him further away. "I know," he whispered. "I wasn't there when I should have been. I'm so sorry, Charlie. I tried to find you. I tried every day." For a long moment, there was only the sound of Charlie's quiet sobs, the weight of Tom's words hanging in the air. Ethan felt like an outsider, watching a wound that was too deep to heal in a single moment. "I don't know if I can believe you," Charlie said, his voice breaking. She said you were going to send us away." Tom's head dropped, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Charlie, I would never send you away. You are my son. I love you more than anything in this world. I've been lost without you." Charlie stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. His small fists were clenched tightly at his sides, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back the storm of emotions. Finally, Charlie whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." Ethan stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Charlie, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to not know what to do right now. But your dad has been looking for you, fighting for you. Give him a chance." Charlie's lip trembled, and for a moment Ethan wasn't sure if he was going to run or stay. Then slowly, Charlie turned to Tom, his body still tense but no longer on the verge of bolting. I don't know how to do this," Charlie admitted, his voice so soft Ethan almost didn't hear him. Tom looked up, his eyes filled with relief and love. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out together." The next few days passed in a blur of fragile steps toward reconnection. Tom stayed in New York, renting a small apartment nearby so he could spend time with Charlie. Each meeting was tentative, filled with careful conversations and awkward silences. The emotional wounds were deep, but there were glimmers of hope, a hesitant smile here, a shared story there. But just as things seemed to be slowly mending, a new storm rolled in. Maggie Hartman arrived in New York, and she was furious. Tom had called Ethan, frantic, when Maggie showed up unannounced at his apartment, demanding to see Charlie. She was livid, claiming that Tom was an unfit father, that he had abandoned Charlie and left him to fend for himself on the streets. When Maggie showed up at Ethan's apartment the next day, her face was set in a cold, furious mask. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes blazed with indignation. "I'm taking him back," she declared the moment Ethan opened the door. Ethan frowned, his hand still on the doorframe. "Maggie, this isn't the time." "I don't care," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Tom is not fit to be his father. He abandoned my daughter, and now he's abandoned Charlie." Charlie, who had been sitting on the couch with a book in his hands, looked up at the sound of her voice. His eyes widened in fear as Maggie stepped inside, her gaze locked onto him. "Charlie, darling," she said, her voice softening as she approached him. "I'm here to take you home." Charlie recoiled, his face pale. I don't want to go with you." Maggie's expression hardened. "You don't understand, sweetheart. You need someone who can take care of you, someone who loves you." "Tom loves him," Ethan interjected, stepping between them. "He's been searching for Charlie for years, Maggie." Maggie turned on Ethan, her eyes cold and calculating. "And where was Tom when Charlie's mother needed him? Where was he when Sarah was losing her mind, when she was crying for help?" Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to stay calm. "Tom didn't abandon Sarah. You know she was ill. He was trying to help her." Maggie shook her head, her voice trembling with anger. "He didn't help her enough. If he had, Sarah would still be alive." Charlie stood frozen, his wide eyes darting between Ethan and Maggie. His hands gripped the edge of the couch, and Ethan could see the fear written all over his face. "Maggie," Ethan said firmly, stepping closer to her, "this isn't the place for this conversation. If you want to talk about custody, we can handle it legally. But right now you need to leave." Maggie glared at him, her jaw set in anger. "You think you can keep me away from my grandson?" she hissed. "I'll see you in court, Ethan, and I'll make sure Tom never sees Charlie again." With that, she stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Ethan turned to Charlie, who was trembling, his small frame hunched over, as if bracing for another blow. "It's going to be okay," Ethan said softly, kneeling in front of him. "We'll figure this out." Charlie nodded, but his eyes were filled with fear and uncertainty. The peace they had started to build was crumbling, and Ethan knew that the battle for Charlie's future had only just begun. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Maggie filed for full custody of Charlie, citing Tom's absence and his inability to protect his son as grounds for removing him from Tom's care. Her legal team was aggressive, painting Tom as a negligent father who had abandoned both his wife and child. Maggie's cold fury was a force to be reckoned with, and Ethan could see how deeply rooted her resentment toward Tom was. To her, this wasn't just about Charlie. It was about punishing Tom for everything that had happened to Sarah. Ethan fought back fiercely, determined to protect Tom and Charlie's fragile relationship. He gathered every piece of evidence he could, proving that Tom had been searching for his son relentlessly. But it wasn't enough. Maggie's lawyers brought up Tom's mistakes, his absence during Sarah's decline, the fact that he hadn't been there the night she took Charlie and ran. The pressure weighed heavily on everyone. Charlie was caught in the middle, torn between the grandmother who had been a part of his life and the father who was trying to make amends. The court proceedings took a toll on him, and Ethan could see the emotional strain in the boy's eyes every time they entered the courtroom. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day in court, Ethan sat down with Tom in his office. Tom looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. "I don't know if I can do this, Ethan," Tom admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I walk into that courtroom, it feels like I'm losing more of Charlie." Ethan shook his head, trying to reassure him. "We'll get through this, Tom. We just need to stay focused." Tom's eyes were filled with guilt. "I failed him. I failed both of them, Sarah and Charlie, and now Maggie's going to take him away from me." Ethan felt a knot of frustration in his chest. "You didn't fail them, Tom. You did everything you could, and you're still fighting for Charlie. That's what matters." Tom didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of his guilt was crushing him, and Ethan didn't know how to lift it. "We'll win this," Ethan said, more to convince himself than Tom. "We have to." But deep down, he wasn't sure. The case was slipping away from them, and he knew that Maggie's influence in the court was stronger than they had anticipated. The fight wasn't just for custody, it was for the very heart of Charlie's future. And Ethan knew that the next few weeks would push them all to the breaking point. The courtroom felt colder each day. Ethan sat rigidly beside Tom at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the judge, as Mrs. Hartley's lawyer wrapped up his opening remarks. The accusations came like a flood. Tom was irresponsible, negligent, absent when it mattered most. Each word was like a punch to the gut, and Ethan could feel Tom shrinking beside him, his guilt hanging heavy in the air. Maggie Hartley, seated across from them, kept her eyes locked forward, her expression hard and unrelenting. To her, this wasn't just a custody battle, it was justice. She had already lost her daughter, and in her mind, Tom was to blame. Now she was fighting to reclaim what was left of her family, even if it meant taking Charlie away from his father. Your Honor, it's clear that Mr. Miller has failed as a father, Maggie's lawyer concluded, his voice slick with confidence. He left his son vulnerable, alone, and living on the streets. Mrs. Hartley is the only one who can provide the stable, nurturing environment that Charlie deserves. Ethan clenched his jaw, the fire inside him barely contained. He wanted to leap to his feet and shout the truth, that Tom had spent every waking moment searching for Charlie, that he had never given up. But he knew that wouldn't win this battle. This had to be fought with facts, not emotion. When the time came, Ethan stood, smoothing his suit and stepping confidently toward the judge. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, waiting for his rebuttal. This was the moment he had trained for, the one place where he always knew what to say, where he had control. Your Honor, opposing counsel would have you believe that my client, Mr. Miller, simply abandoned his family. But the truth is far more complex. Ethan's voice was steady, filled with quiet determination. Tom Miller did not walk away from his son. His son was taken from him by circumstances beyond his control, by a tragedy that none of us could foresee. Ethan paced slowly in front of the courtroom, his gaze sweeping across the jurors. Tom has spent the last 3 years tirelessly searching for Charlie, working with law enforcement, private investigators, anyone who could help. He never gave up. He has been a father fighting against impossible odds to bring his son home. As Ethan continued, he could feel the energy in the room shift. The jurors were listening intently, some of them casting sympathetic glances at Tom, who sat with his head bowed. Ethan's words seemed to reach them, to chip away at the hardened narrative Maggie's team had built. But as Ethan spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The facts were there, but the emotional weight of Maggie's claims lingered like a dark cloud over the proceedings. And then came the moment that Ethan had been dreading, Charlie's testimony. Charlie stood nervously at the witness stand, his small hands gripping the wooden edge as if it were the only thing holding him upright. His green eyes flicked between his father and his grandmother, his face pale and drawn. Ethan's heart broke for the boy. He was being forced to choose between two people he didn't fully understand, and it wasn't fair. Charlie, the judge said gently, her voice softening for the young boy, can you tell us how you feel about your father? Charlie hesitated, biting his lip the way he always did when he was nervous. Ethan could see the battle playing out in his eyes, the confusion, the pain, the fear of making the wrong choice. My mom, Charlie began, his voice small, she said my dad didn't want us anymore, that we had to leave because he didn't love us. Tom visibly flinched at the words, his head lowering as if the weight of them was too much to bear. Ethan could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath, waiting for Charlie to continue. But then, Charlie swallowed hard, his voice cracking. Then Mr. Hartman, Ethan, he told me that my dad had been looking for me, that he never stopped, and I don't know what to believe anymore. Tears welled up in Charlie's eyes and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. I want to believe my dad, he whispered, but it's hard. It's really hard. The room was silent. The judge watched Charlie closely, her expression soft with sympathy. Maggie's lawyer stood up, approaching the boy carefully. Charlie, the lawyer said, his tone sickeningly sweet, you've been through a lot, and I know this must be confusing for you. But do you feel safe with your grandmother? Charlie nodded slightly, glancing at Maggie, who gave him a tight-lipped smile. And do you feel safe with your father? Charlie hesitated. His eyes flicked to Tom, who was sitting stiffly in his chair, his face pale. I think so, Charlie said finally, his voice trembling. But I'm scared. Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to stand up, to shout that Charlie didn't need to be scared, that Tom would never hurt him. But he knew that wouldn't help. The damage had been done. The seeds of doubt were firmly planted, and now all they could do was wait for the judge to make her decision. As the days dragged on, the strain began to show on everyone. The courtroom became a battleground, each side hurling accusations and counter-arguments, their voices rising with the tension that filled the air. Ethan fought with everything he had, but it felt like they were slowly losing ground. Then came the moment that tipped the scales. Maggie's lawyer produced a piece of evidence that caught Ethan off guard. It was a letter written by Tom to Sarah just before she left. In it, Tom expressed his frustration with their failing marriage and his concern for Charlie's safety. But the letter also contained a line that Maggie's lawyer seized upon with vicious precision. Maybe we're better off apart. Ethan hadn't known about the letter. Tom had never mentioned it. And now, as it was read aloud in court, Ethan could see the impact it had on everyone, the jurors, the judge, and worst of all, Charlie. Maggie's lawyer hammered the point home. Your Honor, this letter clearly shows that Mr. Miller was contemplating leaving his family long before Sarah ever took Charlie and ran. This is not a man who was dedicated to his family. This is a man who wanted out. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He needed to counter this, but how? The letter was damning, and the way Maggie's team spun it made it seem like Tom had given up on his family long before Charlie ever went missing. When the court recessed for the day, Ethan turned to Tom, his eyes filled with frustration and disappointment. Why didn't you tell me about the letter? He asked. His voice was low and tense. Tom looked away, guilt written all over his face. I didn't think it mattered, he muttered. It was just something I wrote when I was angry. I didn't mean it. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep his temper in check. It matters, Tom. It matters a lot. Tom's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked like a man completely defeated. I was scared, he admitted. I thought if you knew, you'd stop fighting for me. Ethan's anger faded as he saw the raw vulnerability in Tom's eyes. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm not going to stop fighting, Tom, but you've got to be honest with me from now on. No more surprises. Tom nodded, but the damage was done. The letter had created a rift in their defense, and Ethan wasn't sure how to close it. As the trial continued, the weight of the letter hung over them like a dark cloud. Ethan did his best to redirect the narrative, to show the court that Tom's frustrations had been born out of concern for his family, not a desire to abandon them. But it was an uphill battle, and each day felt like they were slipping further away from victory. Then one night after a particularly brutal day in court, Ethan sat down with Tom and Charlie. They were in Ethan's apartment, the mood heavy with the weight of the trial. Charlie was sitting on the couch, his knees pulled up to his chest, his eyes distant. Charlie, Tom began hesitantly, his voice soft and filled with regret. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Charlie looked up, his green eyes clouded with uncertainty. The letter that they read in court today, it's true, I wrote it, and I'm so sorry that I did. I was angry and I wasn't thinking clearly, but I never meant it. I never wanted to leave you. Charlie didn't say anything, but Ethan could see the hurt in his eyes. I've made a lot of mistakes, Tom continued, his voice breaking, but one thing I never gave up on was finding you. I love you, Charlie, and I know I've let you down, but I'm asking you for another chance. Please? The room was silent, the tension thick as Charlie processed his father's words. Ethan held his breath, watching the boy's face, hoping, praying that this would be enough. Finally, Charlie spoke, his voice small and fragile. I don't know if I can trust you. Tom's face crumpled, and he nodded, tears filling his eyes. I understand, he whispered, but I'm not going to stop trying. No matter how long it takes, I'll keep fighting for you. Charlie stared at him for a long moment, his lip trembling. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, he whispered, but it's going to take time. Tom let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. I know, and I'm not going anywhere. Ethan watched the scene unfold, a wave of emotion crashing over him. This was the turning point, the moment where things could either start to heal or fall apart completely. And for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. The days leading up to the final hearing were a tense blur of preparation. Ethan, Tom, and Charlie walked on eggshells around one another, each trying to navigate the delicate balance between hope and fear. Ethan worked tirelessly to repair the damage done by the letter, while Tom focused on spending whatever time he could with Charlie, building the fragile trust that had only just begun to take shape. Maggie Hartley, however, wasn't backing down. She filed additional motions to prove her case, pushing harder with each passing day. Her belief that Charlie belonged to her was unshakable, and Ethan knew that when they entered the courtroom for the final time, it would be a fight to the bitter end. The morning of the verdict, Ethan stood beside Tom outside the courthouse. The early autumn air was crisp, the city buzzing with its usual frenetic energy, but inside everything was quiet. Ethan adjusted his tie, glancing at Tom, whose eyes were clouded with anxiety. "Whatever happens today," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, "you've done everything you can. Charlie knows the truth now, and that's what matters." Tom nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides and his face was pale. I can't lose him, Ethan. Not after everything." Ethan placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, offering a firm squeeze. "We're not going to lose." Inside, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited for the judge to arrive. Maggie sat across from them, her expression cold and resolute. Charlie was seated between Ethan and Tom, his small hands gripping the edges of his chair tightly, his eyes wide with apprehension. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. It was the culmination of everything, the long, grueling battle for Charlie's future, the strained relationships, and the desperate hope for redemption. Finally, the doors opened, and Judge Thompson entered the room, her face unreadable as she took her seat at the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom stood as one. Judge Thompson glanced over her notes, then looked up, her eyes moving between Tom and Maggie. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing as the judge began to speak. "This has been a difficult case," Judge Thompson said, her voice measured. "Both parties have presented compelling arguments, and it is clear that both Mr. Miller and Mrs. Hartley cared deeply about Charlie's well-being." Ethan held his breath, feeling the tension build with each word. He cast a quick glance at Tom, who was pale and trembling beside him, his hands clasped tightly together. "However," Judge Thompson continued, her voice softening slightly, "the primary concern of this court is what is in the best interest of the child. After reviewing all of the evidence and considering Charlie's testimony, I have reached a decision." The room was so quiet that Ethan could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. His heart felt like it was going to burst from the pressure, and he gripped the edge of the table, waiting. "I am awarding full custody of Charlie Miller to his father, Mr. Tom Miller." Tom's breath left him in a single, shaky exhale. His head dropped into his hands, and for a moment, it looked like he might break down right there in the courtroom. But before the judge could continue, she raised a hand to signal that there was more to her ruling. "However," Judge Thompson said, her tone growing firm, "I also believe that Charlie deserves the opportunity to maintain a relationship with his maternal grandmother. Therefore, I am granting Mrs. Hartley regular visitation rights to be supervised by the court." There was a beat of silence as everyone processed the decision. Tom sat frozen beside Ethan, his eyes wide with disbelief, while Maggie's expression hardened, though her eyes showed a hint of sadness. "The court is adjourned," Judge Thompson announced, and with a single bang of the gavel, it was over. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a victory, a complicated victory, but a victory nonetheless. He turned to Tom, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "You did it, Tom," Ethan said, his voice soft. "You won." Tom blinked, as if the reality of the moment hadn't fully registered. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, small at first but growing with each passing second. I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I get to take my son home." Charlie, who had been silent throughout the verdict, looked up at his father with wide eyes. "We're going home?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Tom nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "Yeah, buddy, we're going home." The days following the court ruling were a mixture of relief and adjustment. While the victory in court meant that Tom had custody of Charlie, it was clear that the emotional scars from the ordeal would take time to heal. Ethan kept a close watch over both of them, making sure they took things one step at a time. Tom rented a small apartment near Ethan's place just until he and Charlie could find a more permanent home. He didn't want to rush the process. He wanted Charlie to feel secure, to know that this wasn't just another temporary arrangement. It was a fresh start. And for the first time in years, Tom allowed himself to believe that things could finally be okay. Charlie, though still shy and reserved, began to open up little by little. He and Tom spent their days getting to know each other again, rebuilding the bond that had been lost during the years apart. Tom took Charlie to parks, museums, and anywhere else the boy wanted to go, determined to show his son that he was there for him, always. Ethan stayed close, though he knew when to give them space. He still felt like a part of their journey, and every time he saw them together, something inside him softened. It wasn't just about winning the legal battle anymore. It was about watching two people rebuild a life that had been shattered and knowing he had played a part in it. One evening, about a week after the ruling, Ethan invited Tom and Charlie over for dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just a spaghetti and salad, but it was the first time they had all sat together in a more relaxed setting since the trial ended. As they ate, Tom looked over at Ethan, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't think I've had a real meal in months," he joked. "Thanks for this, Ethan." Ethan waved him off, his own smile faint but genuine. "You've been through hell. You deserve a break." Charlie, who had been mostly quiet throughout the meal, suddenly piped up. "Hey, Dad," he asked, his voice hesitant but curious. Tom looked over at him. "Yeah, buddy. Can we go stargazing, like you promised?" Ethan's heart clenched at the innocence of the request. It was such a small thing, but it meant so much. The promise had been made during one of their first conversations after the trial, and now Charlie was holding Tom to it. Tom smiled, his eyes softening. "Of course we can. What do you say, Ethan? Want to join us?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the invitation. He hadn't expected to be included, but the warmth in Tom's voice told him that this was a family moment he was welcome to be a part of. A lump formed in his throat, but he pushed it down, nodding with a smile. "I'd love to." Later that night, they all headed to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city where the sky was dark enough for the stars to shine through. The grass was cool beneath them as they spread out blankets, lying back and staring up at the vast expanse above. Charlie was the first to speak, pointing up at the sky with excitement. "Look, that's the Big Dipper, right?" Tom smiled, nodding. "That's right. Good eye, buddy." Ethan lay beside them, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. The stars twinkled above, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything seemed right. There were no courtrooms, no legal battles, no tension or fear. Just a father, his son, and the friend who had helped bring them back together. Charlie's voice broke the silence again. "Ethan, did you always know how to find the stars?" Ethan chuckled softly, turning his head to look at the boy. "No, not always. I had to learn, but it's easier when you've got someone to show you." Charlie nodded thoughtfully, his eyes wide with wonder as he gazed up at the sky. "I'm glad you helped us," he said quietly. You're part of our family now, right?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that, hadn't even considered it, but the sincerity in Charlie's voice, the way he looked at him with trust and affection, made Ethan's heart swell. He glanced at Tom, who smiled softly, giving him a slight nod. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I guess I am." Months passed and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Tom and Charlie moved into a small house just outside the city where they could start fresh. Ethan visited often, but he made sure to give them the space they needed to fully heal and grow as a family. Charlie's relationship with his grandmother, Maggie, was complicated, but with the court-ordered visitation in place, they managed to find a balance. Maggie, though still stern and set in her ways, eventually softened, realizing that Charlie's happiness was more important than her own pride. She didn't fight Tom anymore, and though they weren't close, they learned to coexist for Charlie's sake. For Ethan, the journey had been more than just a case. It had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He no longer cared about climbing the corporate ladder, about chasing accolades or titles. What mattered now was the people in his life, the relationships he had neglected for so long, the connections he had rediscovered. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet suburban neighborhood where Tom and Charlie now lived, Ethan stood on their front porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Tom joined him, leaning against the railing, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't taken that phone call?" Tom asked, his voice low. Ethan smiled softly, shaking his head. "All the time." Tom looked at him, his gaze filled with gratitude. "You saved us, Ethan. You brought my family back together." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, but he didn't let it show. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You saved yourselves, Tom. I just gave you a nudge." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink. The world felt full of possibilities, uncertain, yes, but hopeful. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. "I think this is where I belong," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to Tom. Tom glanced at him, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I think so too." As the night settled in and the stars began to dot the sky, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't about redemption or success anymore. It was about being part of something bigger, something more meaningful than he had ever imagined. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was home. Weeks after the court's final ruling, life began to take on a new rhythm for Tom, Charlie, and Ethan. The echoes of the courtroom drama faded, and with it, the lingering tension that had hung over all their interactions. What was left was the chance for real healing, a quiet, fragile opportunity to rebuild what had been broken. Tom and Charlie were adjusting to their new home just outside the city. It was modest, but it was filled with warmth. The house had a small backyard where Charlie spent hours playing, lost in his own world of exploration. Inside, the walls were covered with photos, new memories, but also old ones Tom had rediscovered from the years before Charlie's disappearance. Each image was a reminder of the life they were trying to restore, one piece at a time. Ethan was a frequent visitor, though he no longer felt like an outsider. In the weeks since the trial, he had become more than just a friend or a former lawyer. He had become part of their family. He and Tom had fallen into a comfortable routine of dinners, long talks, and quiet evenings, spent watching movies with Charlie curled up between them. There was a sense of belonging that Ethan hadn't felt in years, and he found himself cherishing the simplicity of these moments more than he had ever thought possible. One evening, Tom and Ethan sat out on the back porch, watching as Charlie darted through the yard, chasing fireflies. The sky was a deep shade of blue, and the stars were just beginning to emerge. A sense of peace hung over the scene, like a blanket draped over their new lives. "Hard to believe it's been almost 2 months since the verdict," Tom said, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was soft, but there was a note of disbelief in it, as if he still couldn't quite grasp that the battle was over. "Feels like longer, doesn't it?" Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair. "But in a good way." Tom nodded, his eyes following Charlie's movements as the boy ran through the grass, his laughter echoing in the cool night air. "Yeah, in a good way." There was a long pause, the kind that only exists between people who have shared something profound, something that binds them in a way words can't quite explain. "Thank you, Ethan," Tom said quietly, his gaze still fixed on Charlie. "I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can ever say it enough. You didn't just win a case for me. You gave me my son back." Ethan looked down at his hands, a strange lump forming in his throat. He had heard Tom thank him 100 times since the trial ended, but each time it felt more than just gratitude. It felt like something deeper, a recognition of the fact that, through helping Tom and Charlie, Ethan had also found something he didn't even know he was searching for. "I didn't do it alone," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You and Charlie, You two did the hard part. I just pointed you in the right direction." Tom chuckled softly. "You know, you don't give yourself enough credit." Ethan smiled faintly, but his thoughts were already drifting. The truth was, Tom's words had been haunting him lately. He had spent so much of his life focused on his career, chasing a success that now seemed hollow in comparison to the joy he found in moments like these. The trial had changed him, shaken something loose inside him that had been locked away for years. For the first time in his life, Ethan was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than being the best lawyer in the room. A few days later, Maggie Hartley came for her first supervised visit with Charlie. Ethan had helped Tom navigate the legal logistics of the arrangement, but even with the court-ordered visitation, the tension between Tom and Maggie was palpable. Though the judge had ruled in Tom's favor, the years of bitterness and blame that Maggie held toward him hadn't simply disappeared. She still believed that Tom was responsible for Sarah's death, and that belief, no matter how unfounded, remained a wedge between them. Charlie, for his part, was nervous about seeing his grandmother. He hadn't spent time with her since the trial, and though he didn't express it directly, Ethan could see the anxiety in the boy's posture as they waited for her to arrive. When Maggie finally stepped through the door, the room seemed to stiffen. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same severe style, her expression carefully neutral, but there was an undeniable hardness in her eyes when they landed on Tom. "Hello, Charlie," she said, her voice softening as she knelt down to embrace him. "I've missed you, darling." Charlie hugged her back, but Ethan could see the hesitation in his movements. There was love there, yes, but there was also something more complicated, a sense of uncertainty that lingered in the air. For the next hour, Maggie spent time with Charlie, asking him about school, his friends, and the things he'd been doing with his dad. The conversation was polite but stilted, as if there were unspoken barriers preventing either of them from truly relaxing. At the end of the visit, when Maggie stood to leave, she turned to Tom, her expression unreadable. "I'll be back next week for the next visit," she said, her tone cold. Tom nodded, his face impassive. "Of course." For a moment it seemed like that was the end of it. But just as Maggie reached the door, she hesitated, turning back to face Tom. Her gaze softened, just slightly, and for the first time in years there was something almost vulnerable in her eyes. "I still don't forgive you, Tom," she said, her voice low and trembling. "But I'm starting to see that maybe I've been holding on to the wrong things." Tom looked at her, surprise flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but Maggie was already stepping out the door, leaving the words unsaid. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, his mind turning over the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the weeks passed, life settled into a routine. Tom and Charlie grew closer with each passing day. They took trips to the library, played catch in the backyard, and shared quiet moments reading together before bed. The emotional distance that had once existed between them had begun to close, and though there were still moments of hesitation, of unspoken fears and doubts, they were learning how to trust each other again. Ethan, too, had found his place in their lives. He wasn't just a lawyer who had won their case. He was their friend, their confidant, and in some ways, a part of their family. He spent his weekends with them, joining in on trips to the park or helping Charlie with his school projects. There were moments during those quiet evenings together when Ethan would catch himself thinking that maybe this was what happiness felt like. Something small, something simple, but something undeniably real. But despite the peace that had settled over their lives, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging sense that he needed to make a decision about his own future. His law firm had been pressuring him to return full-time, to pick up where he left off. They wanted him back in the courtroom, back in the cutthroat world of corporate law, where he had once thrived. And yet, the thought of returning to that life felt suffocating. The Ethan who had walked into that firm years ago was not the same man who now sat on a porch in a quiet neighborhood, watching the stars with his best friend's son. One evening, as the sun set over Tom's backyard, Ethan finally voiced the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about leaving the firm," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Tom, who had been sipping his coffee beside him, looked over in surprise. "Really?" Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. Yeah, it doesn't feel right anymore. The work, the long hours. I don't want that life. Tom was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. What would you do instead? Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe something that actually helps people instead of just winning cases. I've been thinking about family law, helping people like you and Charlie. It feels more meaningful. Tom smiled, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. You'd be good at that. Ethan looked at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, I think I would. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was on the right path. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Months later, Ethan stood in his new office, a small, unassuming space nestled in the heart of the city. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it was exactly what he needed. A fresh start. He had officially left his old firm, stepping away from the world of corporate law and into a new chapter of his life. Family law wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling in a way Ethan hadn't expected. He was helping people rebuild their lives, just as he had helped Tom and Charlie, and each case felt like a small victory, one that actually mattered. As Ethan looked around his office, taking in the clean lines of the desk and the soft hum of the city outside, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called, smiling when he saw Tom and Charlie step inside. Hey, Tom said, grinning as he took in the new space. Nice place. Charlie, now more confident and relaxed than Ethan had ever seen him, walked over to the desk, running his fingers over the polished wood. Are you going to help more families like ours? He asked, his green eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan smiled, nodding. That's the plan, kiddo. Charlie beamed, then looked up at Ethan with a serious expression. I'm glad you're doing this. Ethan's heart swelled at the boy's words, and he crouched down to Charlie's level, resting a hand on his shoulder. Me too, Charlie. Tom stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's back. You've come a long way, Ethan. I'm proud of you. Ethan looked at him, his chest tight with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you and Charlie. They stood there for a moment, the three of them together, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He had found a family, not the one he had expected, but one that had changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. As they left the office, stepping out into the cool evening air, Ethan looked up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, twinkling above the city like a promise of everything that was still to come. The future was uncertain, but it was full of possibilities. And for Ethan, Tom, and Charlie, that was more than enough. I hope you were touched by this story of love, redemption, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed the journey of Ethan, Tom, and Charlie, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and allows me to continue bringing you more powerful, heartfelt stories. There's a new story waiting for you, one filled with emotion, triumph, and unforgettable characters. Don't miss it. Click to subscribe and join me on this incredible storytelling adventure. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.